At the heart of this story lies a couple whose lives intertwine wealth, humility, and resilience. As they navigate systemic biases, an unexpected encounter at an airport security checkpoint reveals the agent's prejudices. What begins as a moment of humiliation transforms into a confrontation with power structures, ultimately challenging societal norms and the agent's own beliefs. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The faint golden light of dawn crept through the blinds of the Bennett household. Inside the spacious, tastefully decorated living room, the sounds of the city waking up were barely audible through the thick, insulated walls. A vase of freshly picked flowers adorned the marble countertop in the kitchen, their fragrance mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Avery Bennett sat at the dining table, her long, graceful fingers holding a steaming mug. Her phone vibrated softly beside her, a reminder of the busy day ahead, but for now she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. Avery was the picture of poise and elegance, with flawless cocoa skin and sharp, expressive eyes that revealed a blend of warmth and determination. At 32, she had built a reputation as an accomplished attorney specializing in civil rights cases. This weekend, however, wasn't about work. She and her husband, David, were flying to attend a high-profile charity gala, a fundraiser for underprivileged youth, an initiative close to their hearts. Avery glanced at the large clock on the wall and called out, "David, we're going to be late if you don't hurry. You know I hate rushing through the airport." From upstairs, David's voice responded, tinged with mock indignation. "Late? We're hours early. You've got that lawyerly paranoia again." A chuckle escaped Avery's lips. David Bennett had always been the calm to her storm. Where Avery thrived on meticulous planning and schedules, David carried a natural, unflappable ease. At 35, he exuded a quiet confidence that often caught people off guard. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jawline and kind eyes, he was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. What most people didn't know and what David preferred to keep private was the extent of his influence. As the co-owner of a private firm managing several high-profile properties including airports, he had access to a world of power and privilege that few could fathom. Yet he wore his success lightly, avoiding ostentation at every turn. For David, actions mattered more than appearances. Descending the stairs in a navy blazer and light khaki slacks, David took one look at Avery and let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said, pausing at the last step. "That dress. You might just outshine everyone at the gala." Avery glanced down at her custom-designed gown. The midnight blue fabric shimmered subtly in the light, its tailored fit accentuating her athletic figure. It was elegant without being ostentatious, a reflection of her personality. She gave David a playful smile. "Flattery isn't going to save you if we miss this flight." David walked over, placing a light kiss on her cheek. "Relax. We've got plenty of time." The ride to the airport was smooth, the city streets alive with the buzz of morning activity. Avery tapped away at her phone, responding to last-minute emails, while David hummed along to the soft jazz playing on the radio. Their chauffeur, Gerald, navigated the familiar route with practiced efficiency. The Bennett couple traveled often, but this trip carried a particular sense of excitement. The charity gala was a culmination of months of work, and Avery was looking forward to seeing the results of their efforts to raise awareness about educational inequality. Pulling into the VIP parking area, Gerald stepped out to open their doors. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," he said warmly, tipping his hat. "Thanks, Gerald," David replied, sliding a generous tip into the driver's hand. Avery smiled at the man before turning toward the airport entrance. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was a mix of bustling travelers and the sterile efficiency of modern air travel. The Bennetts were regulars at this airport, but Avery couldn't shake the faint unease she always felt in public spaces. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as they approached the TSA security checkpoint. The TSA line wasn't crowded, but it moved with the slow inevitability of government bureaucracy. Avery removed her heels and placed them in a bin along with her clutch and phone, her movements deliberate and precise. She glanced over at David, who was sliding his laptop into a tray. He caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. "Nothing to worry about," he murmured as they waited their turn to pass through the scanner. Avery's gown caught the attention of a few nearby travelers who admired its craftsmanship with discreet glances, She was used to such attention and met it with the quiet grace that had become second nature. What she didn't notice, however, was the calculating gaze of the TSA agent at the far end of the checkpoint. Kevin Doyle was in his late 40s, with a weathered face and an air of practiced authority. His years in the TSA had left him jaded and resentful, a man who had long since stopped seeing travelers as individuals. To Kevin, they were merely obstacles in his path, and every shift was an exercise in asserting control over those who crossed his checkpoint. His eyes narrowed as he watched Avery step forward, the sleek fabric of her gown shimmering under the fluorescent lights. Kevin didn't like what he saw. In his mind, people like Avery, a black woman radiating wealth and confidence, didn't belong in his world. She was too polished, too poised, too much of everything he resented. "Step aside, Mom," Kevin said, his voice cutting through the hum of the terminal. Avery froze mid-step, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me," she asked, her tone polite but firm. "I said step aside," Kevin repeated, gesturing toward a small screening area to the left. Random check. David looked up sharply, his easy demeanor hardening into quiet vigilance. He stepped forward instinctively, placing himself slightly between Avery and Kevin. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with an edge. Kevin barely glanced at him. "Routine check, sir. Nothing to worry about." Avery nodded, though the pit of unease in her stomach deepened. She followed Kevin to the designated area, her bare feet cool against the linoleum floor. David remained by the conveyor belt, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. In the small screening area, Kevin gestured for Avery to spread her arms. She complied, her movements measured. Kevin began his search, his hands brushing against the fabric of her gown with deliberate carelessness. "This is quite the dress," he remarked, his tone laced with something unspoken. "Must have cost a fortune." Avery's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She had dealt with men like Kevin before, men who cloaked their hostility in casual remarks, their words laced with implications they didn't dare voice outright. Kevin's hands moved lower, lingering unnecessarily near the hem of her gown. Suddenly there was a sharp, tearing sound as his fingers accidentally caught on the delicate fabric. Avery gasped, stepping back instinctively as she looked down to see a jagged tear running along the seam of her dress. "I'm sorry, Mom," Kevin said, his voice devoid of genuine remorse. "Accidents happen." Avery's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her composure cracking for the first time. "That gown is worth more than your annual salary," she said, her voice cold as ice. Kevin smirked, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "I was just doing my job," he said with a shrug. David, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low but commanding. "Just a routine check," Kevin replied, his tone smug. David's eyes flicked to Avery, taking in the tear in her dress and the tension in her posture. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the calm facade he wore so well slipped. "This isn't over," Avery said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. As they walked away from the checkpoint, Avery's mind raced with a mix of anger and humiliation. She wasn't sure how, but she knew one thing for certain: Kevin Doyle had no idea who he was dealing with. David and Avery walked in silence toward the lounge area, their steps heavier than when they first entered the airport. The polished tiles reflected the lights above, but the glow felt harsh now, like an interrogation spotlight. David's hand rested lightly on the small of Avery's back, a subtle gesture of comfort, though his jaw remained tight. Avery felt exposed, her torn dress no longer a badge of elegance but a cruel reminder of humiliation. She carried herself with her usual poise, yet each step through the crowded terminal felt like an eternity. Passers-by glanced curiously at the tear along her side, though none dared to say anything. The VIP lounge loomed ahead like a sanctuary. A smartly dressed attendant greeted them at the door, her polished smile faltering when her eyes fell on Avery's dress. "Mrs. Bennett," Mr. Bennett, the attendant said quickly, recovering her composure. "Welcome back. Is everything all right?" Avery nodded curtly, her lips pressing into a tight line. David, however, paused just long enough for the attendant to notice his unreadable expression. "We're fine," he said after a moment, his voice cool. "But could you bring us a moment of privacy in our corner booth?" Of course, sir. Right away. The booth offered a view of the bustling terminal through a floor-to-ceiling window, though Avery barely glanced at the scene. She sank into the plush leather seat, folding her hands tightly on the table in front of her. David slid into the seat opposite her, his gaze unwavering as he studied her face. "It's not just the dress," David said softly, breaking the silence. Avery met his eyes, the words catching her off guard. For a moment she considered brushing it off. After all, she'd faced worse microaggressions in courtrooms, on sidewalks, even at country clubs that had no problem cashing their donation checks while silently questioning her place. But this felt different. It wasn't just a slight, it was an act of calculated humiliation. "No," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not just the dress." David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Tell me what you're thinking." Avery exhaled, letting the tension uncoil slightly. "I keep asking myself, why did he target me? Was it the dress? My skin? The way I carried myself? Or was it just because he could?" Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of hurt. "I've spent my entire career fighting for people who face this every day. And today I was the target." David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He was a man who measured his responses, who chose his words as carefully as an architect laying bricks. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You're right, he did it because he could, but he has no idea who he was messing with." Avery tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips despite herself. "And who am I, exactly?" she teased, her voice softening. David's lips curved into a small grin. "You're Avery Bennett, brilliant attorney, fierce advocate, and incidentally married to someone who owns this place." Avery's laugh came unexpectedly, a short burst of relief that lightened the weight on her chest. "That's your big plan? To flash your name like a badge?" she asked, though there was no malice in her tone. David shrugged, his grin widening. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll just remind Kevin Doyle that actions have consequences. But only if you want me to. It's your call." Avery leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, a young family with 2 toddlers rushed toward their gate, the mother laughing as she tried to herd her children. The scene was mundane yet comforting, a reminder that life went on despite the moments that felt insurmountable. "Not yet," she said finally. "I need time to think." "But David," she met his eyes again, her tone shifting. "Promise me you won't let this slide if I decide to take it further." David reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You have my word." As they waited for their flight, Avery's thoughts remained heavy, but the sanctuary of the lounge allowed her to regain some composure. She had always prided herself on resilience, on the ability to rise above, but today's encounter gnawed at her in a way she couldn't shake. David excused himself to make a call, leaving Avery alone with her thoughts. She absently scrolled through her phone, reading messages from friends and colleagues, their words filled with anticipation for the gala. She knew the event would be a triumph, a culmination of months of work, but for the first time she wondered if she could muster the energy to celebrate. A movement near the entrance caught her eye. A young black woman in her early 20s stood hesitantly by the reception desk, clutching a backpack and looking slightly out of place among the polished travelers. Avery watched as the attendant gestured toward the seating area, her smile warm and welcoming. The woman nodded and made her way to a corner seat, her posture radiating both nervousness and determination. Avery felt a pang of recognition. She saw herself in that young woman, a reflection of the early days of her career when every step into a new space felt like a test, a question of belonging. Without thinking, Avery rose from her seat and approached her. "Excuse me," Avery said gently, offering a warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice you seem a little new to this. First time in the lounge." The woman looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Yes, ma, I am," she admitted, her voice soft. I got upgraded by my company, and I didn't know this was included. It's so fancy here." Avery chuckled, sitting down across from her. "It can be intimidating, but it's just a waiting room with nicer chairs," she said, her tone light. "What's your name?" "Jasmine," the woman replied. "Jasmine Walker." "Well, Jasmine Walker," Avery said, her smile widening. "You're here because you earned it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jasmine's smile grew, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you. That means a lot. As they chatted, Avery felt a sense of purpose return. Jasmine reminded her of why she fought so hard for representation, for equity, for a world where women like them could exist unapologetically. By the time David returned, she felt steadier, more certain of herself. What I miss, David asked, sliding into the seat beside Avery. Just making a new friend, Avery replied, her tone light but meaningful. She glanced at David, a spark of determination in her eyes, and reminding myself why I don't let people like Kevin Doyle win. David's lips quirked into a smile. I had a feeling you'd get there. Avery squeezed his hand, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly how she would handle Kevin yet, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't let him define this day. As the flight announcement echoed through the lounge, Avery rose, smoothing her dress as best she could. Let's go, she said, her voice steady. We've got a plane to catch. And as they walked toward the gate, Avery held her head high, ready to face whatever came next. The plane had just leveled out at cruising altitude when Avery closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat. The hum of the engines, coupled with the soft chime of a flight attendant preparing refreshments, filled the cabin. David, seated beside her, was scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at her with concern. Though outwardly calm, Avery's mind was anything but quiet. The events at the security checkpoint replayed in her head like an unwelcome reel, each moment sharper than the last. She thought of Kevin Doyle's smirk, his dismissive tone, the intentional rip of her dress. It wasn't just an insult to her dignity, it was a deliberate attempt to diminish her humanity. And yet, the quiet anger simmering in her chest wasn't just for herself. It was for the countless others who had endured similar, or worse, indignities in silence. Penny, for your thoughts, David's voice broke through her reverie. Avery opened her eyes, turning to meet his gaze. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel grounded, even when the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. She gave a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm trying to figure out why this one incident feels so heavy, she admitted. It's not like I haven't faced this kind of thing before. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes it's not the first or the worst thing that gets to us. It's the one that catches us off guard. You were on your way to something exciting, wearing that gorgeous dress, and he took that moment and tried to ruin it. Avery considered his words. There was truth in them, but there was more to it. It's not just about me, she said finally. It's about the principle of it. How many times has someone like Kevin gotten away with treating people like that? How many others have had their days, their dignity stolen by someone on a power trip? David didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air between them. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll figure it out, he said simply. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but Avery's mind remained preoccupied. By the time they landed and exited the terminal of their destination airport, she had resolved to take action. She didn't yet know what form that action would take, but doing nothing wasn't an option. A sleek black car waited for them outside, the driver stepping forward to greet them with a polite nod. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, welcome, he said as he opened the door for them. Thank you, Avery replied, sliding into the back seat. David followed, settling in beside her as the car pulled away from the curb. The ride to their hotel was smooth, the city skyline glowing against the evening sky. Avery stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The torn seam of her gown had been pinned for the time being, but it still felt like a glaring wound, a reminder of what had happened. As they pulled up to the Grand Hotel hosting the gala, Avery straightened her shoulders. She wouldn't let Kevin Doyle ruin this night. The driver opened the door, and David stepped out first, extending a hand to help Avery. Cameras flashed as they made their way inside, reporters and photographers capturing the arrival of the event's distinguished guests. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was electric. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd, their conversations a hum of excitement. Avery greeted acquaintances with her usual grace, her smile practiced but genuine. Yet, beneath the surface, she remained on edge. David excused himself to mingle with a few business associates, leaving Avery alone for a moment. She made her way to the refreshment table, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As she reached for a glass of sparkling water, A voice behind her made her pause. "Mrs. Bennett, what a pleasure to see you." She turned to find herself face to face with Margaret Hensley, the head of the foundation hosting the gala. Margaret was a formidable woman in her 60s, with a sharp wit and a reputation for getting things done. Margaret Avery said warmly, extending her hand. "It's so good to see you." Margaret's keen eyes flicked over Avery's dress, lingering on the pinned seam. "What happened here?" she asked, her tone curious but concerned. Avery hesitated, debating how much to reveal, but she knew Margaret well enough to trust her. "Let's just say a TSA agent took his job a little too far," she said lightly, though her tone carried an edge. Margaret's expression darkened. "Do you mean to tell me someone at the airport caused this?" Avery nodded, giving a brief summary of the incident. As she spoke, Margaret's eyes narrowed, her mouth tightening into a thin line. "That's outrageous," Margaret said when Avery finished. "People like that thrive on impunity. If you ask me, he shouldn't just get away with it." Avery smiled faintly. "I agree. But the question is, what do I do about it?" Margaret's expression softened. "You're a brilliant attorney, Avery, and you're in a position to make a difference. Use your platform. Speak up. If you don't, who will?" The words struck a chord with Avery. She had spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms, but this felt different. This was personal, and yet it was also universal. Margaret was right. "I'll think about it," Avery said finally. "Thank you, Margaret." Margaret squeezed her hand. "Anytime." As the evening progressed, Avery found herself surrounded by supporters and colleagues, their conversations a welcome distraction. David rejoined her after a while, his presence steady and reassuring. Yet, despite the festivities, the incident with Kevin Doyle remained in the back of her mind. Later that evening, as they returned to their hotel suite, Avery stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. David watched her from the doorway, sensing her restlessness. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Avery turned to face him, her expression resolute. "I need to do something, David. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated the way I was today." David nodded, stepping closer. "I figured as much. What's the plan?" Avery took a deep breath, the weight of her decision settling over her. "I'm going to file a formal complaint, and if that doesn't lead to accountability, I'll escalate. This isn't just about one agent. It's about a system that enables this kind of behavior." David placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "I'll support you every step of the way." Avery smiled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She wasn't sure what the road ahead would look like, but she knew she wouldn't walk it alone. Together, they would ensure that Kevin Doyle and others like him would think twice before wielding power so carelessly. As she turned back to the window, the city lights seemed to shine a little brighter. For the first time since the incident, Avery felt a spark of hope. This was just the beginning. The morning after the gala, Avery sat at the desk in their hotel suite, her laptop open in front of her. Sunlight poured through the large windows, illuminating the room in a warm glow, but Avery was focused entirely on the screen. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as she drafted a formal complaint against Kevin Doyle. David, still dressed in his pajama pants and a white t-shirt, entered the room holding 2 cups of coffee. He placed one next to Avery and sat across from her at the small table. "Good morning, counselor," he said with a teasing grin. "Looks like you're already hard at work." Avery glanced up, offering a faint smile. "Good morning. I didn't want to waste any time." David sipped his coffee, watching her for a moment. "Want to talk it through?" Avery nodded, turning the laptop to show him the draft. "This is the formal complaint I'm submitting to TSA's Oversight Committee. I'm detailing the events, citing the Code of Conduct violations, and demanding an investigation. I'll also copy their Public Relations Department. Something tells me they don't want this to go viral." David leaned forward, scanning the text. "Looks thorough," he said, nodding approvingly. "But are you stopping at just this complaint?" Avery hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the screen. "No, this is the first step. If they don't take action, or if their response feels like lip service, I'll escalate. Press coverage, legal action, whatever it takes." David's smile widened. "That's my wife. Strategic and relentless." Avery chuckled softly, though her resolve was evident. I've spent too many years fighting for change to let someone like Kevin Doyle off the hook. It's not just about him, David. It's about the entire culture that lets people like him act with impunity. David reached across the table, taking her hand. And I'll back you every step of the way. But you don't have to do this alone, Avery. Let me help. She squeezed his hand, her expression softening. I know you will. Thank you. By midday, Avery had finalized and sent her complaint. The next step was gathering evidence. She and David had already checked social media for any posts about the incident, but so far, nothing had surfaced. Still, Avery was confident there had been witnesses, passengers who had seen the torn dress or overheard Kevin's comments. Let's see if we can find anyone who was there, Avery said, pacing the hotel room. There were at least a dozen people in line behind me. Someone must have noticed. David, now seated on the couch with his laptop, glanced up. We could put out a public call for witnesses, he suggested. You know how things spread online. All it takes is one person to post about it. Avery paused, considering the idea. That could work. If we're specific enough about the time and location, it might reach someone who was there. David nodded, already typing. I'll draft something now. We can post it on our social media accounts and ask friends to share. Avery sat beside him, watching as he wrote the post. Were you at airport name on date around time? Did you witness an incident at the TSA checkpoint involving a torn dress and a black woman being mistreated by an agent? If so, please contact us. Your account could help hold the responsible parties accountable. Looks good, Avery said. But let's keep the tone professional. I don't want it to sound accusatory yet. David nodded, tweaking the wording before posting it. Within minutes, their phones buzzed with notifications as friends and colleagues began sharing the post. The first reply came less than an hour later. A woman named Cynthia Morales sent a direct message to Avery's account, explaining that she had been in line behind them at the checkpoint. I remember the agent being really rude, Cynthia wrote. I didn't see everything, but I noticed how he handled your dress. It looked intentional. I'm happy to share what I saw. Avery immediately replied, thanking her and setting up a phone call. She and Cynthia spoke later that afternoon, with Avery taking detailed notes. He seemed to single you out, Cynthia said over the phone. I remember thinking, why is he picking on her? And when I saw the tear in your dress, it just didn't sit right with me. It felt deliberate. Thank you for reaching out, Avery said sincerely. Your account is incredibly helpful. Would you be willing to provide a written statement if it comes to that? Absolutely, Cynthia replied. I can't stand seeing people treated unfairly. By the end of the day, Avery had heard from two more witnesses. One was a man named Jake Peterson, who had recorded part of the encounter on his phone. He sent Avery the video, a shaky but clear recording of Kevin Doyle making dismissive remarks as Avery confronted him about the torn dress. The footage sent a surge of anger through Avery as she watched it. Kevin's smirk, his mocking tone, the way he brushed off her words as if her dignity was irrelevant, it was all there, captured for anyone to see. David watched over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. This is damning, he said quietly. If TSA doesn't act after seeing this, they're going to have a PR nightmare. Avery nodded, her mind racing. The video strengthened her case significantly, but she knew it also raised the stakes. If the situation went public, it could draw significant attention, not all of it positive. Are you ready for this to go viral? David asked, sensing her hesitation. Avery took a deep breath, steeling herself. If that's what it takes to make them listen, then yes. The next morning, Avery received a call from TSA's regional director, Helen Rogers. Her tone was professional but cautious, indicating that she was well aware of the potential fallout. Mrs. Bennett, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention, Rogers began. We take these allegations very seriously, and I want to assure you that we've already begun an internal investigation. Avery listened, her expression unreadable. And what does that entail, exactly, she asked. Rogers hesitated briefly before responding. We're reviewing surveillance footage from the checkpoint, interviewing the agent in question, and speaking with any witnesses we can identify. We aim to resolve this matter quickly and fairly. Fairly, Avery repeated, her tone cool. I trust that includes holding Mr. Doyle accountable for his actions. Of course, Rogers said quickly. If the investigation confirms misconduct, appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. Avery remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of her pause settle over the call. I appreciate the update, she said finally, but I'll be watching closely, and if I sense any attempt to sweep this under the rug, I won't hesitate to escalate. Rogers assured her that wouldn't be the case before ending the call. Avery placed her phone on the table, exhaling slowly. They're feeling the pressure, she told David, but I'm not convinced they'll do the right thing without more incentive. David leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Then we keep building the case. If they don't act, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened. Avery nodded, her resolve hardening. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. This wasn't just about Kevin Doyle anymore. It was about dismantling a culture of unchecked authority and ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. As she turned back to her laptop, the sunlight streaming through the window felt less like a spotlight and more like a beacon. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. And she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The sun blazed high over the airport as Avery Bennett walked briskly across the polished floor of the arrivals terminal, her heels clicking with purpose. A few passengers turned their heads as she passed, her tailored navy pantsuit cutting a sharp, professional figure. She wasn't here to fly, she was here to confront the system that had failed her. Beside her, David matched her stride, his expression calm but resolute. Unlike Avery, who carried a folder of neatly prepared documents, David had nothing in his hands. He didn't need to, his presence alone was a reminder of the power they wielded. TSA's regional office was tucked away in an administrative wing of the airport, far from the bustling gates and ticket counters. When they arrived, Avery stopped to glance at the directory on the wall, ensuring they were headed in the right direction. This is it, she said, more to herself than to David. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. You've got this. Avery nodded, taking a deep breath. She had spent the past week preparing for this meeting, gathering witness statements, video evidence, and legal precedents. The folder in her hand wasn't just a collection of papers, it was a carefully constructed case against Kevin Doyle and the broader culture of negligence within TSA. When they entered the office, a young receptionist greeted them with a nervous smile. Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, welcome. The director is expecting you. Avery smiled politely, though her nerves were tightly coiled beneath the surface. Thank you. The receptionist led them down a short hallway to a glass-walled conference room. Inside, Helen Rogers, the regional director of TSA, stood to greet them. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a professional demeanor, her tailored suit mirroring Avery's. Beside her sat a man in a TSA uniform, Kevin Doyle. The sight of him sent a surge of anger through Avery's veins, but she quickly masked it. Kevin avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, Rogers began, gesturing to the table. Please, have a seat. Avery and David sat opposite Rogers and Kevin, the glass walls allowing a clear view of the busy terminal beyond. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on Avery. Here she was, fighting for justice in the heart of the very system that had wronged her. Before we begin, Rogers said, folding her hands on the table, I want to express my deepest apologies for the incident at the security checkpoint. It's never our intention for passengers to feel disrespected or mistreated. Avery held her gaze, her voice measured. I appreciate your apology, but I'm here to ensure that this isn't just swept under the rug. What happened to me was a deliberate act of humiliation by your employee, and based on the evidence I've gathered, it's clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Rogers's expression tightened slightly, though she maintained her professional tone. We've conducted an internal investigation, and we take these allegations very seriously. Mr. Doyle has been temporarily reassigned while we review the findings. Reassigned, Avery's voice sharpened. Not suspended, not terminated, just reassigned. Rogers hesitated, glancing at Kevin before responding. We believe in due process, Mrs. Bennett, until all evidence is thoroughly examined. I have the evidence right here, Avery interrupted, placing the folder on the table. Witness statements, video footage, and a detailed account of Mr. Doyle's actions. If that's not enough to take immediate action, then your due process is just an excuse to protect your own. Rogers's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. May I see the evidence? Avery slid the folder across the table, her eyes never leaving Rogers's face. As the director flipped through the documents, the tension in the room thickened. Kevin shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. After a few minutes, Rogers set the folder down, her expression grave. This is compelling, she admitted. I can assure you that Mr. Doyle's actions will be addressed appropriately. That's not enough, David interjected, his voice calm but firm. We've heard promises of accountability before, but they often lead to quiet reprimands and no real change. What guarantees do we have that this won't happen again to Avery or anyone else? Rogers opened her mouth to respond, but Avery leaned forward, her tone unyielding. Here's what I want. First, Kevin Doyle needs to be terminated immediately. His actions were not just unprofessional, they were abusive. Second, TSA needs to implement mandatory sensitivity training for all agents, starting with this airport. And third, I want a public acknowledgement of this incident, along with a commitment to systemic changes. Kevin's head snapped up, his face paling. You can't be serious. Quiet, Rogers said sharply, cutting him off. She turned back to Avery, her expression conflicted. Your demands are substantial. They're necessary, Avery countered. This isn't just about me, it's about the countless others who don't have the resources or platform to fight back. If TSA is serious about earning the public's trust, it starts here. Rogers leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the folder of evidence. Finally she exhaled deeply. Mrs. Bennett, I won't deny that this is a serious matter. And I agree that change is necessary. I can't make promises on the spot, but I will take your demands to our leadership team. As for Mr. Doyle, she turned to him, her tone cold. Your employment is under immediate review. You are suspended, effective immediately, pending further investigation. Kevin's face contorted with a mix of anger and fear. This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job. No, Avery said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Your job is to ensure passenger safety, not to humiliate and dehumanize people for your own satisfaction. You crossed the line, and now you're facing the consequences. Kevin glared at her, his jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Rogers stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mrs. Bennett. I assure you this isn't the end of the conversation. Avery and David rose as well, their expressions unwavering. It better not be, Avery said, because if I don't see real action, I'll take this public. And trust me, the court of public opinion is far less forgiving. Rogers nodded, her face taut with tension. Understood. As Avery and David walked out of the office, the weight of the confrontation began to lift. Avery's steps felt lighter, her resolve solidified by the progress they had made. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. You were incredible in there, David said, his voice filled with admiration. Avery smiled, slipping her hand into his. I couldn't have done it without you. As they exited the terminal, the bustling airport felt less oppressive than before. Avery knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of control. This was more than a fight for justice, it was a step toward changing the system itself. And Avery Bennett wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The media frenzy began 2 days later. Avery hadn't initially intended for her complaint against Kevin Doyle and the TSA to become a public spectacle, but once word spread through social media, thanks in part to the witnesses who had come forward, it was unstoppable. The video of Kevin's smirking dismissal of Avery's torn gown was shared by a prominent activist on Twitter, and the post quickly went viral. Within hours, TSA accountability was trending, and Avery found herself at the center of a national conversation about abuse of power. Sitting at her dining room table, Avery scrolled through the overwhelming wave of responses on her phone. Some messages were supportive, applauding her bravery and sharing similar stories of discrimination at the hands of TSA agents. Others, predictably, were filled with vitriol, accusing her of overreacting or playing the race card. David entered the room with 2 cups of coffee, placing one beside her. How bad is it, he asked, leaning against the table. Avery sighed, setting her phone down. Mixed. Lots of support, but also plenty of people defending Kevin or claiming I'm exaggerating. David sipped his coffee, his expression calm. That's always going to happen. But the fact that it's gotten this much attention means you've struck a nerve. This isn't just about Kevin anymore, it's about the entire system. Avery nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we have to make sure this moment counts. That afternoon, Avery held a meeting with her legal team, a group of sharp-minded professionals who had stood by her side during many of her civil rights cases. They gathered in her home office, their laptops and notepads scattered across the table. I want to take this beyond Kevin Doyle, Avery said, her tone firm. This is about holding TSA accountable for the culture that enables this kind of behavior. Her attorney, Sandra Lee, nodded. The video evidence and witness statements are a strong foundation. But if we want systemic change, we'll need to push for policy reform, not just disciplinary action against one agent. Avery leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. What are our options? Sandra adjusted her glasses, flipping through a legal pad. We can demand a formal audit of TSA practices, focusing on racial bias and abuse of authority. If they resist, we can involve advocacy groups and even push for a congressional hearing. The key will be keeping public pressure high. A younger attorney, Marcus Green, chimed in. I've been compiling data on similar incidents reported over the past 5 years. There's a clear pattern of disproportionate targeting of minority travelers. If we can present this alongside your case, it strengthens the argument for systemic reform. Avery's mind raced with possibilities. She had always believed in using her platform to create change, and this felt like an opportunity to do something meaningful. Let's move forward with both strategies, she said. Push for immediate accountability while laying the groundwork for broader reform. Sandra smiled. I thought you'd say that. We'll draft the necessary documents and start reaching out to partner organizations. Meanwhile, the TSA was scrambling to contain the fallout. Kevin Doyle had been officially terminated, a decision announced via a press release that emphasized the agency's commitment to professionalism and fairness. But the statement did little to quell public outrage. Inside a conference room at TSA headquarters, Helen Rogers sat across from a group of senior officials, their faces etched with frustration. This isn't going away, Rogers said, her voice tight. We need to address the root causes before this escalates further. Avery Bennett is pushing for reform, and if we don't cooperate, we risk losing control of the narrative. One official, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, shook his head. Cooperate? If we cave to her demands, we set a precedent. Every disgruntled passenger will think they can dictate our policies. And if we don't, Rogers countered, we risk a public relations disaster. This isn't just about one passenger. It's about years of complaints piling up, and people are finally paying attention. If we don't act now, Congress will force us to. The room fell silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Rogers spoke again. We need to be proactive. Let's propose a plan for mandatory sensitivity training and create an independent oversight committee to review complaints. If we frame it as a commitment to improvement, we can regain public trust. After a moment, the others nodded reluctantly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Later that week, Avery stood behind a podium at a press conference, cameras flashing as she addressed a crowd of reporters. Her legal team stood beside her, along with representatives from civil rights organizations that had joined her cause. This is not just about one incident, Avery began, her voice steady. It's about a culture of unchecked power that allows abuses like this to happen. When people go through airport security, they should feel safe, not humiliated or targeted because of their race, gender, or appearance. She paused, scanning the crowd. We're demanding accountability and transparency. The TSA must implement mandatory bias training for all agents, establish an independent oversight body to handle complaints, and publicly commit to creating a safer and fairer environment for all travelers. Reporters shouted questions as she stepped back, but Avery ignored them, her heart pounding. She had delivered her message, now it was up to the public to amplify it. The pressure worked. Over the next month, TSA announced several new initiatives, including a pilot program for sensitivity training and the creation of a passenger advocacy hotline. Avery's case was cited repeatedly in discussions on systemic reform, her name becoming synonymous with the fight for accountability. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The the backlash from certain corners of the public remained fierce, with critics accusing her of overreaching or seeking attention. Through it all, Avery remained steadfast, her focus on the bigger picture. One evening, as she and David sat on their balcony overlooking the city, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The fight was far from over, but the progress they had made was undeniable. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" she asked quietly, staring at the twinkling lights below. David reached over, taking her hand. "I don't think it's about doing enough. It's about doing what we can, with the time and resources we have. And you've done more than most people ever will." Avery smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. After all, change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And she was just getting started. Weeks turned into months, and Avery Bennett's case had evolved into a movement that stretched far beyond her original complaint. The public debate over TSA policies intensified, spurred by personal stories of travelers coming forward. Social media was flooded with hashtags like Dignity in Travel and Stops Abuse, turning the once monolithic agency into a symbol of a broader systemic issue. Avery spent her days in a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. The sheer scale of the movement was daunting, but she remained resolute, driven by the stories of countless others who had experienced similar indignities. This morning, she sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open to an email from the Department of Homeland Security. The message outlined the new initiatives the TSA had agreed to implement, including an independent oversight committee and enhanced sensitivity training for all employees. It was a victory, but Avery knew the fight wasn't over. David joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. "Good news?" he asked, sitting across from her. "It's progress," Avery replied, tapping the screen. "They've committed to the oversight committee and training, but it's still just words on paper. We need to make sure it actually happens." David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've already done so much. For every inch of change, you've pushed the needle miles forward." Avery smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel like enough yet." David reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "It never does when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. But trust me, Avery, you've made a difference." Later that afternoon, Avery arrived at a downtown hotel where a public forum on TSA reform was being held. The large conference room was packed with reporters, travelers, and community leaders. Avery felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination as she stepped onto the stage, flanked by her legal team and representatives from civil rights organizations. The moderator introduced Avery, recounting her story and the impact it had on the national conversation. The room erupted in applause as she approached the microphone. "Good afternoon," Avery began, her voice steady. "When I filed my complaint against the TSA months ago, I never imagined it would lead to this. At the time, I was just one person standing up against an injustice. But what I've learned since then is that my story isn't unique. It's part of a much larger pattern, a pattern that too many people have been forced to endure in silence." She paused, scanning the audience. "Today, we're not just talking about one incident or one agency. We're talking about dignity, respect, and accountability. These aren't abstract ideas, they're basic human rights. And they shouldn't disappear the moment you step into an airport." The crowd nodded, some breaking into applause. Avery continued, her confidence growing. "The TSA's recent commitments to reform are a step in the right direction, but they're just that, a step. Real change requires vigilance. It requires all of us to hold institutions accountable, to push for transparency, and to demand better." As she finished her speech, the audience rose to their feet, their applause reverberating through the room. Avery felt a swell of pride and hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it belonged to everyone who had joined the movement. After the forum, Avery lingered to speak with attendees. One by one, people approached her to share their stories, some heartbreaking, others infuriating, all validating her decision to stand up. A middle-aged woman with graying hair introduced herself as Clara Thompson. "Mrs. Bennett." She began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to thank you. My son is on the autism spectrum, and he's been subjected to so much unnecessary stress during TSA screenings. Your fight has given families like ours hope." Avery reached out, squeezing Clara's hand. "Thank you for sharing that. Your story matters, and it's why we're doing this, to make sure no one else has to go through what your family has. Moments like this kept Avery grounded. Each story was a reminder of the stakes, of the countless lives affected by systemic flaws. As the crowd began to thin, she spotted a familiar face in the corner of the room: Helen Rogers, the TSA regional director who had been present during her initial meeting. Helen approached cautiously, her professional demeanor intact but softened by an air of contrition. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, extending a hand, "I wanted to speak with you." Avery shook her hand, her expression neutral. "Director Rogers, what brings you here?" "I've been following the movement closely," Helen admitted, "and I wanted to let you know that your efforts have made an impact. The Oversight Committee is already being assembled, and the sensitivity training program launches next month. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Avery nodded. "It's a good start, but it's only the beginning. What matters is follow-through, ensuring these changes aren't just cosmetic." Helen hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. And I want you to know that I'm committed to seeing this through. If you ever feel that the TSA isn't living up to its promises, I hope you'll bring it to my attention." Avery studied her for a moment, then offered a small smile. "I'll hold you to that." That evening, Avery returned home to find a package waiting on the doorstep. Inside was a beautifully handwritten letter from one of the witnesses who had come forward during her case: Cynthia Morales, the young woman who had been in line behind her at the security checkpoint. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Bennett, I wanted to thank you for your courage and determination. Watching you stand up to someone like Kevin Doyle inspired me in ways I can't even put into words. It reminded me that we all have a voice, and when we use it, we can create change. Because of you, I've decided to pursue a career in law. I want to fight for justice the way you do. You've shown me that one person really can make a difference. With gratitude, Cynthia Morales." Avery felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the letter. She handed it to David, who smiled as he read it. "You're inspiring the next generation," he said softly. "That's no small thing." Avery sat down, staring at the letter in her hands. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. It wasn't just about the policies she had pushed for, or the changes TSA had promised. It was about the people whose lives had been touched, the ripple effect of standing up and saying, "Enough." As she placed the letter on the counter, she turned to David with a determined smile. "This is just the beginning." David grinned, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "To the beginning of something great." Avery raised her own imaginary cup, her heart full of hope. The road ahead was long, but for the first time she felt ready to walk it. 6 months after the day that had forever changed Avery Bennett's life, she stood on the stage of a packed auditorium. The room buzzed with energy, a mixture of students, activists, and community leaders who had come to hear her speak. The event was hosted by a prominent civil rights organization entitled Voices for Change, a call to action. As Avery looked out at the crowd, she took a moment to absorb the magnitude of what had happened since that fateful day at the airport. What began as a personal battle for dignity had blossomed into a national movement. Her journey had been exhausting, but it had also been transformative, not just for her, but for countless others. The moderator introduced her with enthusiasm, recounting her story and the changes her fight had catalyzed. As the applause swelled, Avery stepped forward, her heart steady, her resolve stronger than ever. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "Thank you for being here, for believing in the power of change." The room quieted, all eyes fixed on her. "When I stood in that TSA line months ago, I never imagined where it would lead. At the time, I felt small, powerless, a single person against a system that seemed untouchable. But in the weeks and months that followed, I learned an important truth: no one is truly powerless. When we speak out, when we stand together, we have the ability to move mountains." Avery paused, her gaze sweeping the audience. "This journey hasn't been easy. There were moments when I questioned myself, moments when I wondered if the fight was worth it. But then I'd hear from people like the mother who wrote to tell me her son no longer dreads going through security, or the young woman who decided to pursue a career in law because of this movement. Those stories reminded me why I started this fight and why we can't stop now." The crowd erupted into applause, but Avery raised a hand, urging them to quiet. The changes we've seen so far, oversight committees, training programs, increased accountability, are just the beginning. Real change takes time, persistence, and a collective effort. It's not about one person, it's about all of us demanding better. Her words resonated deeply. The audience's faces reflected hope, determination, and a shared understanding of the work that lay ahead. After her speech, Avery mingled with attendees, her presence magnetic. She spoke with young activists, seasoned organizers, and curious students, each conversation reinforcing the importance of the movement. One attendee, a young black man named Terrence, approached her nervously. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, clutching a small notebook, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself. I work as a school counselor, and after seeing what you did, I filed a complaint about some discriminatory policies at my school. It's still a battle, but at least I'm fighting now." Avery smiled warmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Terrence, that's incredible. It's people like you who make this movement real. Keep fighting. You're making a difference." The interactions left Avery energized, a reminder that her work was far from over but was already bearing fruit. As the months passed, the ripple effects of Avery's fight continued to spread. The TSA's newly implemented sensitivity training showed promising results, with early surveys indicating a decline in passenger complaints. The Independent Oversight Committee gained traction, its members reviewing and resolving cases that had once been ignored. More importantly, other industries began examining their own practices. Inspired by Avery's story, advocacy groups pushed for reforms in workplaces, schools, and healthcare systems. The message was clear: unchecked authority would no longer go unchallenged. Avery became a sought-after speaker and consultant, her expertise in civil rights and systemic reform invaluable. She balanced her newfound role with her work as an attorney, though she carefully guarded her time to avoid burnout. One evening, as she sat in her office, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. Congress had announced a new bipartisan task force to review security practices across federal agencies, citing Avery's case as a key catalyst. David entered the room moments later, holding 2 glasses of wine. "Saw the news," he said, handing her a glass. "Looks like you're changing the country one agency at a time." Avery laughed, though her eyes glistened with emotion. "It's not just me," she said, her voice soft. "It's everyone who stood up, who shared their stories, who believed we could be better." David raised his glass in a toast. "To change," he said, "and to the woman who started it all." They clinked glasses, the weight of their journey shared in that quiet moment. Months turned into a year, and Avery found herself once again in the familiar surroundings of an airport. This time she was traveling to Washington, D.C., to testify before Congress as part of the task force's review. As she approached the TSA checkpoint, she noticed a subtle but significant shift. The agents greeted passengers with professionalism and care, their interactions far more respectful than before. Avery handed over her ID to a young agent, who smiled warmly as he checked it. "Have a great flight, Mrs. Bennett," he said, his tone sincere. Avery thanked him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, but it was progress. On the flight to D.C., Avery reflected on the path she had walked. The fight had taken a toll, but it had also brought purpose, connection, and hope. As the plane ascended into the clouds, she closed her eyes, imagining the countless lives that had been touched by the movement she helped ignite. When the plane landed, Avery stepped onto the tarmac with a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't just a woman who had fought for justice, she was part of a collective force for change. And as she walked into the halls of Congress, she knew this was only the beginning of the legacy she would leave behind.